ladies and gentlemen, and just to start by explaining, this talk is based on an article, as mentioned by Arthur, published in the Burlington magazine in September last year, which was co-written with Louisa Brower, National Trust Curator for Ickworth House, who I think is attending tonight. And I'd like to express my thanks to her. It was a joy writing the article with her, and as indeed it was, collaborating with her on the acquisition of this wonderful piece. And on behalf of both of us, I'd like to express our gratitude to Martin Levy and Peter Cameron, who assisted invaluably with the acquisition process. Christie's sale of the 4th of June 2019, and with the assistance of the Art Fund and a fund set up by the late Simon Sainsbury, the National Trust secured for Ickworth and Suffolk a silver-framed looking glass, seen here, of 1777-8, marked for the London goldsmith Frederick Kandler. It's engraved with the arms of Augustus Harvey, 3rd Earl of Bristol, seen here in his portrait by Reynolds, and must have been a gift from the Earl to his mistress and companion, Mary Nesbit, seen in her portrait by Reynolds on the right, probably forming part of a dressing or a toilet service. And a quick note here before going further on about nomenclature. Those such services or sets were described as both toilet or toilette, with a double T-E on the end, and dressing plate during this period. Dressing was in use from at least the 1670s, as verified by the Thomas Wicks ledger in the Goldsmiths Company's collection. And it was the term in common parlance in Britain by the second half of the 18th century. So though generally in curatorial terms, these services tend to be referred to as toilet services, it's actually evidenced by accounts, journals and letters of the period that by the late 18th century, dressing was the more common term that was used. It's the one I'm going to tend to use tonight. In addition, in the 17th and 18th centuries, glass is used rather than mirror, and looking glass is the consistent description throughout the ledgers of the retail goldsmith George Wicks and his successors. Dressing services was strongly associated with marriage, and the existence of the looking glass is redolent with meaning in the context of the histories of the 3rd Earl and Mary Nesbit. The glass is the only one by Kandler known to survive, though he is likely to have played some role at least in that produced early in his career by his older relation, Charles Kandler, for the Empress Anna of Russia, now in the State Hermitage Museum, seen here. The Ickworth looking glass is of the highest quality, as might be expected, from one of the foremost London goldsmiths and designers of the period, and its combination of elements that are stylistically both retardataire and of the latest fashion is a reflection of the complex symbolism of dressing services in 18th century Europe. The looking glass frame is oblong with a shallow arched top and is formed of silver of sterling standard, which has been embossed and chased with the addition of hand-modelled and cast elements. There is a cast gadrooned sight edge, and the lower rectilinear part of the frame has a bold outer band of gadrooning too. Above, the conceit is of a continuation of the same form, but concealed by the draping over of a fringed mantling or cloth gathered into 3 choux, or bunches. You can see at the top, 2 of them you can see quite clearly. And I'm grateful to Annabel Westman for confirming that this is the correct term for such rounded gatherings of material. With and they're bunched with cords and tassels, and thus drawn away from the surface of the glass. Forming a cresting at the top, a cast and chased quiver with arrows and a bow has been applied to the frame. Roses, convolvulus, and perhaps also peonies intertwine with the quiver and mantling and drop down onto the inner convex moulding of the lower part of the frame. They also emanate from the centre of the base of the frame, at which a cartouche surrounded by applied palm leaves is engraved with the Harvey shield, the ducally collared and chained snow leopard supporters of the Harveys, and their motto, Je n'oublierai jamais, I will never forget, beneath an earl's coronet. It is through the form of these arms that the looking glass can for certain be connected to the 3rd Earl and not to his brother and successor, Frederick Harvey, 4th Earl of Bristol. The latter was married, and at least at the time of his inheritance, on reasonable terms with his wife. Had he commissioned a dressing service for her that included this glass, he would have impaled his arms with hers, as was the usual practice, particularly as it would have been for her use. As is so often the case, the glass itself is a later replacement, probably early 20th century, but the mahogany backing may be the original, though refinished, and it has a hinged mahogany stand to hold the glass at an acute angle. By the time Augustus Harvey, the purchaser of the looking glass, succeeded as 3rd Earl of Bristol in 1775, he was decidedly middle-aged and had already enjoyed a successful career as a naval captain and politician, as is evidenced by this splendid portrait by Gainsborough. Never expecting to inherit the title and family estates as the second son of John Lord Harvey, he only briefly enjoyed the status that mirrored his prominent and at times infamous position in 18th century society. Augustus was born in 1724 to Lord Harvey, seen here, and his wife, Mary or Molly Lepel, who was a popular member of aristocratic society, widely admired for her wit and good sense. And this good sense was to be sorely tested throughout a lifetime of notoriety, not because of her own exploits, but those of her husband and children. Lord Harvey, seen here pointing at a plan in the conversation piece by William Hogarth, was one of the best known figures of the era, holding prominent positions as Vice Chamberlain of the Royal Household and Lord Privy Seal, and being a favourite of Queen Caroline. But it was for his amorous affairs that he attracted most attention. Harvey being widely acknowledged as a sexually ambiguous figure, he formed a string of close romantic relationships with men and women alike, much to the fascination of his contemporaries. He was at the barbed end of the satirical pen of Alexander Pope, whose many unflattering caricatures of him were published over a period of years, and also of Horace Walpole, who described Harvey's death in 1743, rather uncharitably, as a blessing to the man himself, he having outlived the last inch of character. His old friend, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, famously concluded that the human race could be divided into 3 types of people: men, women, and Harveys. Augustus Harvey would carry on this family tradition of notoriety, enjoying a colourful and amorous life, never far from the public spotlight. After entering the Royal Navy in 1735 and quickly being promoted to the rank of lieutenant, Harvey met and fell in love with the infamous Elizabeth Chudleigh. And this might give you an idea of quite how infamous she was. This is her dressed, which is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration, for a masquerade put on by the Venetian ambassador in 1749. In fact, I think this image is an exaggeration. She had a costume made of flesh-coloured silk that was supposedly left little to the imagination. I doubt it was quite as revealing as this might suggest here, but nevertheless, she was constantly courting scandal. Their courtship was brief, with the pair marrying later that year and a clandestine wedding held at 11 o'clock in the evening. The union, kept a secret as he was the youngest son of a baron and she, concerned about her position at court, was largely unhappy, and the pair soon separated. Elizabeth, however, was only getting started. Described as an adventurous and sexual intriguer, the secret Mrs. Harvey, her marriage to the future 3rd Earl never having been dissolved, soon became the mistress and then, in 1769, wife of Evelyn Pierpont, 2nd Duke of Kingston. As Duchess of Kingston, Elizabeth wielded great power with an immense income at her disposal. However, her deceit was not to last. In 1768, prior to her bigamous marriage, Augustus Harvey had announced his intention to sue for divorce. He also was turning his mind to marrying again and had set his sights on the daughter of a Bath physician, Mary Moysey. Elizabeth Chudleigh, being determined to wed the Duke, swore on oath that she was unmarried, and a consistory court declared her a spinster, ordering Harvey not to assert otherwise. It was in the wake of these events that he was to meet the beautiful and intriguing Mary Nesbit, nearly 20 years his junior, and in many ways a younger foil to the beguiling and exasperating Elizabeth Chudleigh. Mary Davis, subsequently Nesbit, seen here in one of two portraits of her by Reynolds, you've seen the other one earlier, hailed from unsophisticated origins, having been born, and I quote, in a wheelbarrow in Covent Garden, according to an account given in Town and Country magazine in 1775. She must have possessed great charm and charisma, for her entry into society as a courtesan and artist model began in 1764 with no less a figure than the artist of this portrait, Sir Joshua Reynolds, soon to become first president of the Royal Academy. In a series of intimate letters between Mary and the miniature painter Esaias Humphrey, Humphrey reminds her that it was on the day of my arrival to settle in London that Mr. Joshua Reynolds introduced me to you. Mary met the Irish-born merchant Alexander Nesbit, and the two married in 1768, although this union too would face scrutiny. In a series of letters printed in the Public Advertiser between 1768 and 1772, aspersions were cast surrounding the circumstances of Mary and Alexander's marriage, with the anonymous author Junius claiming that the young man had long been the dupe of a most unhappy attachment to a common prostitute. Nevertheless, Alexander was to settle on his new bride, a house he had recently built for himself at Norwood in Surrey. That's seen here, securing for her an important degree of security as a woman of means. The marriage was not to last long, with the suggestible, naive, and easily led Mr. Nesbit, as he was described at the time, soon becoming mentally unwell and dying in early 1772. What role Mary may have played in his mental collapse is unknown, although her connections to the demi-monde continued. By 1771, Mary had met Augustus Harvey, and the two formed a close bond, soon living together, apparently faithfully, at Norwood House, which was described at the time as a comfortable and spacious villa. Evidence suggests they were a well-matched couple, forming an unconventional family unit with Augustus's illegitimate son, Augustus Henry Harvey, from a previous relationship. In 1775, however, the by now widowed Duchess of Kingston was accused of bigamy by the Duke's disinherited nephews, and after trial before the House of Lords the following year, the case was upheld. Augustus and Elizabeth were now publicly acknowledged to be what the gossips had correctly surmised for years, man and wife. It was not, however, until 1777 that the Consistory Court set aside the ruling of 1769, and Augustus, now Earl of Bristol, was free to sue for divorce. The coincidence of the looking glass being commissioned that year could well be significant, but if Lord Bristol was intending to pursue divorce in order to be able to marry Mary, he did not do so. He wasn't in particularly good health, and other reasons may well have included the fact that Elizabeth Chudleigh had fled abroad, and therefore to secure a divorce would have been made more difficult, and also his own vulnerability to accusations of complicity in hiding the marriage in the first place. Both Augustus and Mary suffered reputational loss through the circumstances of their marriages, but this did not diminish the strength of their relationship, and indeed may have added to it. They were living as close to husband and wife as could be, and Lord Bristol added substantially to the landholdings at Norwood, as well as furnishings to the house, including portraits of himself and his son, most notably his full-length portrait by Thomas Gainsborough, as you've already seen, and here again, which is now back at Ickworth, again having been reacquired in the 19th century. He had also made generous provision for Mary in his will, bequeathing to her all his personalty and an estate in Lincolnshire. Referred to directly in that will as his dear, valuable, and best friend, it is one particular item commissioned for Mary in 1777-8 that reveals the true regard Augustus held for his companion, the silver-framed looking glass under consideration here. Augustus Harvey had not only inherited the earldom of Bristol in 1775, but also the family seat at Ickworth in Suffolk, together with a large, and thanks to his elder brother, fully solvent landed estate, a townhouse in St James's Square, and extensive collections, including some 16,700 ounces of silver, some of which you can see here, and in exceptional Rococo taste, as you can see from the Tureen 1752 at the foot of the table. Though he still had acrimonious dealings with the Admiralty through his seat in the House of Lords, his active career was essentially over. And as he could not marry again whilst Elizabeth Chudley lived, and unlike him, she remained apparently hale and hearty, and in fact survived until 1788, there was no realistic prospect of him producing a legitimate heir. He was thus without incentive to either disperse or expand the silver, and he was also unlikely to want to update it in spite of its predominantly Rococo style, which might, in other circumstances, have made it susceptible to being melted for replacements in the reigning neoclassical. And that happened in very many cases, one particularly notable one being that of the Cookes, Earls of Leicester, who melted down all their silver by Paul de Lamry to have it remade in the latest fashion, much to the mourning of those devotees who are many of Lamry. The third Earl's bank account with Goslings reveals no obvious activity with goldsmiths, but it is likely that he did not leave the Bristol plate entirely untouched, as it was depleted by nearly 1,400 ounces by the time his nephew, the fifth Earl and future first Marquis of Bristol, succeeded in 1803. An indication that this was the doing of the third Earl, rather than of his brother and successor, Frederick Harvey, fourth Earl of Bristol and Bishop of Derry, is the presence amongst the church plate of St Mary Ickworth of a silver gilt alms dish, here, marked for Frederick Kandler, 1758-9. This fine vessel, with its heavy gadrooning and fluted sides, had started life as part of a dessert service, one of 12 round, oval and octagonal dishes granted to the second Earl as part of his official perquisites on being sent as ambassador to Spain in 1758. Given that the third Earl was responsible for the restoration of the church, the gift of the dish is most probably attributable to him. Furthermore, the lack of any payments to goldsmiths during his time as Earl would suggest that his one known acquisition of silver as Lord Bristol, the looking glass under consideration here, was secured through the turning in of old plate to be melted. Now I'm going to reveal myself to be nerdy, perhaps the word, but anyway, obsessive in my analysis of statistics in this next few sentences, so forgive me, and nod off if you so wish. The 11 remaining dishes of this dessert service weighed 441 ounces, and they would probably have been credited at 5 shillings and 9 pence per ounce, bringing a total of about 127 pounds. The looking glass, with a weight of 57 ounces and 9 pennyweight, and given its ornate character, would have fallen well within this at a cost at 13 shillings and 9 pence per ounce of around 43 pounds, including the mirror glass and backing. If the remainder of the 1,400 ounces of silver depleted from the second Earl's plate, including the other dessert dishes, had been applied to a complete set of dressing plate of similar elaboration, as could well have been the case, and I think is very likely to have been the case, then it would have had an overall weight of around 585 ounces, and would probably have consisted of some 25 to 30 pieces. To put these numbers in context, the Countess of Stamford's 28-piece service of 1754-5, oh, sorry, that's the glass again, and on, predominantly by Magdalen Feline, is recorded at 731 ounces, including a glass of 55 ounces, while that of 17 pieces provided to John Heathcote in 1767 totaled 397 ounces with a glass of 53 ounces. Glass frames supplied by Wicks and his successors, John Parker and Edward Wakelin, between 1740 and 1776 were mostly between 30 and 80 ounces, though that acquired by George Bubb Doddington, later first Baron Melcombe, in 1745 was a prodigious 194 ounces, So if you think this is 55 ounces, then almost 4 times the weight of silver in that mirror, which must have been quite astonishing, and sadly, as far as anybody's aware, does not survive. Whether or not there was a complete set of dressing plate, the looking glass would have made a significant impression on its own as one of the most ornate in Britain from the second half of the 18th century. That accentuates all the more the unusual nature of the commission in light of both the circumstances of the third Earl of Bristol's household, which we've already discussed, and of the strong connotations and conventional use of dressing or toilet services. They'd first become popular in mid-17th century France, and one of the finest surviving French toilet services is illustrated on the left-hand side and survives at Chatsworth, made for Queen Mary II, and had been taken up by the British aristocracy with great enthusiasm after the Restoration, an example being shown on the right from the V&A's collection. As can be seen from the numerous orders placed with Thomas Wicks, not thought to be a relation of George, of London between 1673 and 1684 for sets of boxes and bottles, many of them specified as being square, with pincushions, porringers, often also looking glasses, the occasional pair of candlesticks with snuffers, and one instance at least of a ewer and basin. The constituent parts remained more or less the same for at least the following century. From an early stage, the commissioning of such dressing plate was closely associated with either matrimony or the birth of a child, and was usually, but not always, given by the groom or his family. The service would be displayed on a dressing table, richly clothed in silk damask or later fine lace, in the principal state or great bedchamber, where a new bride or mother would formally receive guests, and where she might thereafter perform her levee, as so potently depicted in Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode. In some instances, dressing plate was left out to be seen by tourists. John Loveday noting in 1739 that Lady Page's toilet, the palatial Ricklemarsh House, Blackheath, was furnished with a great variety of exquisite apparatus, all double gilt. 6 years later, he remarked upon Lady Burlington's silver gilt dressing plate at Chiswick House when he visited that. And the laying out of toilet service or dressing services for visitors continued into the 20th century. It can still be seen in an uninterrupted fashion at Knowle, but also it was recorded as late as 1922 at Ashburnham House in Sussex, where the steward described how the toilet set there was arranged in the bedroom of any grandee who came to stay, and that would have been slightly earlier than that because the silver had already been dispersed by 1922, but nevertheless into the 20th century. George Wicks and John Parker and Edward Wakelin supplied some 17 new looking glasses or full sets of dressing plate between 1740 and 1776. And in only 3 cases is there not a clear connection to either a marriage or birth. Most of the marriages represented were entirely conventional and respectable, but those of the 3rd Duke of Grafton, who bought a looking glass for his second wife, Elizabeth Wrottesley, in 1770, when she was expecting their first child, and of the king's brother, the Duke of Gloucester, seen here on the right, were mired in controversy and scandal. In the latter case, the Duke had married secretly in 1766 Maria, Countess Wargrave, who was not only a commoner, but also illegitimate. And this marriage, as well as that of his brother, the Duke of Cumberland, led to the Royal Marriages Act, which still holds force today in terms of the Queen having to give permission for members of the royal family to marry. 4 years later, her account with Parker and Wakelin as Countess Wargrave was charged for a set of, and I quote, for, and it's down below, but not really easy to read, a set of gilt dressing plate as follows: a looking glass frame, a basin and ewer, a jewel box, 2 comb boxes, 2 powder ditto, 2 paste ditto, 2 essence bottles, and 4 brushes. And you'll see that was very close to what was being provided in the late 17th century. in fact, identical. Presumably, this was in expectation of a public acknowledgement of her marriage, and in 1773, a year after that had finally occurred, and while expecting her second child by the Duke, she augmented the service by adding 2 gilt dressing boxes. There is no doubt that the 3rd Earl of Bristol wanted to wed Mary Nesbit, but he was legally blocked from doing so, and with his health failing, it seems most likely that he was using such a potent symbol of matrimony and family, as was dressing plate, to show his commitment in the absence of church vows and a ring. By engraving thereon his arms, as we saw earlier, rather than, for instance, Mary's monogram, and presumably, given her humble background, she was non-armigerous, as certainly was her late husband. He was even perhaps indicating that he viewed her as his countess. The gift would, therefore, have been in part a touchingly romantic gesture, but the Earl, with the renowned Harvey family's hauteur, which he undoubtedly shared, would also probably have considered it befitting the lady of a great nobleman, however unconventional the relationship. Even his unmarried aunt, Lady Anne Harvey, had her own silver gilt service, and Lord Bristol had shown himself an acute observer of these extravagant signifiers of taste, status, and wealth during his youthful travels on the continent. While in Portugal in 1753, he visited the royal wardrobe and observed, "The gold toilet that was for the present queen when she married, which she has never seen, is very finely finished, and the Brussels lace that covers it all and the bed is beyond whatever could be seen of that kind." And I should just point out, because it's too irresistible not to, it was on this same visit that Harvey was, according to his own memoirs, taken hostage by a rapacious duchess who had her wicked way with him. The task of producing something at once both romantic and dynastic, as well as fashionable, was given to the favoured goldsmith of the Earls of Bristol, Frederick Kandler, a master of sculptural design and someone who had proved himself acutely conscious of changes in fashion, both in Britain and in continental Europe. Despite being close to the end of a very long career, he died in 1778, having flourished since at least 1735. Kandler successfully faced up to the challenge and assimilated elements of the neoclassical, which now held sway, with references to dressing glasses of the past and to romantic love. Looking glasses had, for several decades, mostly had wavy outlines that accorded with the Rococo, as exhibited on those of the services provided by the royal goldsmith Thomas Hemming for Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, George III's sister, the Duchess of Buccleuch, and, seen here, Lady Henrietta Williams Wynne, in respectively 1766, 1767, and 1769, respectively, and all these 3 services survive. Such forms were still being produced in the late 1770s, even by the foremost Parisian masters, as can be seen on a frame of the same year as Kandler's, on the left here, by Robert Joseph Auguste. But as precociously early as 1764-5, greater rectilinearity had been imposed on a glass made for Catherine the Great of Russia by Francois Thomas Germain. Kandler adopted this approach, which had the added potency of also relating to glasses of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I'm showing here one by Anthony Nell in the collection of the National Gallery of Victoria, Melbourne. As too did his decision, presumably consciously antiquarian, to contain the straight sides and base of his frame with gadrooning. There are sufficient survivals of dressing services from as early as the 1720s that are curiously old-fashioned in their form and decoration to suggest that, more than for most other types of domestic silver, stylistic reference to the past, albeit near past, could be as important a factor in the choice of design as the latest fashion. Thus, when the second Earl of Warrington commissioned a dressing service made by Isaac Liger in 1728-9, probably for the state or great bedchamber at Dunham Massey, he opted for something more akin to the production of around 1700. And when Lady Anne Somerset married the 7th Earl of Northampton in 1759. She was presented with a service by Magdalen Feline, seen in the centre, which was not far removed from that produced by John White in 1729-30 for her mother, Elizabeth Berkeley, Duchess of Beaufort, and you can see the Urim Basin from that service on the left. That service is dispersed. There are pieces at Williamstown and elsewhere. And also, even closer to the Beaufort service is the Countess of Stamford's service of 1754-5, also by Magdalen Feline, which was produced for the Earl of Warrington's daughter, and even replicates the Régence engraving found on the Beaufort service. Floral embellishment of the frame, as employed by Kandler, was also far from innovatory in itself, and either he or his older relation, Charles Kandler, had been responsible for the prime three-dimensional example on the Empress Anna's looking glass of circa 1735. It can be seen too on the Hemming looking glasses of the 1760s, detail on the left. But Kandler's later treatment is less asymmetric and tighter in accord with the influence of the neoclassical. The flowers allude to beauty and to Venus, oft suggested in the decoration of dressing plate, and Kandler employed a distinctly French accentuation of the romantic nature of the gift and the allure of its recipient in the quiver, bow, and arrows of Cupid attached to the apex of the curved top rail, seen on the left-hand side here. There are no surviving London-made examples with this detail, at least that I've come across, but it is to be found on Auguste's glass of 1777-8, as referred to previously, and seen here on the right. In that case, in duplicate and with a distinctly amorous pair of doves to symbolize Aphrodite. More innovatory, and if not Kandler's own invention, then likely to have had a continental source from which sprang a later example, is the depiction in silver of a fringed mantling or cloth draped symmetrically over the arched top of the frame, the gathering to keep it clear of the glass, forming cabbage-shaped bunches of material, or shoe, as referred to earlier. This was a clever evocation in silver of the cloth that was traditionally attached to the top of a looking glass and able to be drawn round to cover the entirety of the dressing table and its contents when not in use. In addition, it not only referred to the designs of Daniel Marrow, or of that period at least, and as you can see here in this sconce made by Andrew Moore for Mary II in 1691-2, but also to the very latest fashions in upholstery, such as for dressing windows or for the hangings of a bed. And you can see here the hangings, which, again, thanks to Annabel Westman for her assessment, are likely to be of the 1770s, seen on bed at Strawberry Hill. And you can see very clearly there the gathering of fabric into a shoe. When the third Earl of Bristol died in December 1779, a dispute over the administration of his will immediately arose with members of the Harvey family, which was resolved in Mary's, dispute arose with members of the Harvey family, which was resolved in Mary Nesbit's favour. She gained from the proceedings furniture, jewellery, paintings, a harpsichord, a coach, and a chaise, plus horses, worth in all a considerable sum. Of course, she'd also been left the income from an estate in Lincolnshire as well. And she brought these back to Norwood House. Perhaps triumphantly, Mary was to sit 5 times to Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1781, resulting in the 2 striking portraits that you've already seen and which I'm reproducing again here, now in the Wallace collection and at the Smith College of Art Museum in Massachusetts. Despite the miscellany of her life, as described in the Morning Chronicle in 1797, Mary would go on to acquire an elevation which she has preserved with dignity, according to a contemporary description, establishing at Norwood House an influential political salon, which many distinguished guests attended. This may have occasioned her travels across the continent during the French Revolution, when she was widely rumoured to be acting as a government agent. Nevertheless, by 1809, Mary was in financial difficulty and was forced to let out Norwood House. She died in Paris in 1825 and was buried there, despite the wish expressed by Lord Bristol that she should rest beside him at Ickworth. In her will, Mary Nesbit instructed that the entirety of her estates and effects, real and personal, should be disposed of by auction or private sale for the benefit of her nephew, William Alexander Nesbit Whitmore, who she noted has suffered from a nervous disorder since birth, which renders him unfit so to take care of himself, though of the most amiable and affectionate disposition. Had there been a full dressing service, it could well be that the bulk had already been exchanged for cash, given Mary's latterly straitened circumstances, but the survival of the looking-glass today suggests that she may have retained that at least, and if so, it would have been included in the disposals following her death. No record of an auction has yet been found, and although some items were acquired by family members, including Gainsborough of Lord Bristol, which was bought by his niece Anne Phipps, Lady Murray, the purchaser of the looking-glass has not yet been ascertained. In 1963, however, it re-emerged, being offered for sale anonymously at Sotheby's in London, and it was acquired by Fay Plon of New York City, a major collector of English silver. Prior to a move to Connecticut, Mrs. Plon disposed of her silver at 2 sales in 1970, again at Sotheby's in London, and the looking-glass passed to another key figure in the late 20th century art world, Drew Hines. She had married the heir to the Hines family's fortune, Henry John Hines II, in 1953, and as well as being a major philanthropist to the visual arts and literature, she also assembled significant collections for the couple's houses in the United States and Europe. The looking-glass formed part of the furnishing of the townhouse in London, with its lavish interiors by John Fowler and Lorenzo Mongiardino. Following Mrs. Hines' death in 2018 at the age of 103, the contents were sold by Christie's in London, and the National Trust was able to acquire the looking-glass for Ickworth and thus reunite it with some of the other contents of Norwood House. The looking-glass is of considerable importance in its own right, as well as to Ickworth in particular, and the securing of it for permanent preservation is a cause for celebration. It joins and enhances a silver collection of international repute, assembled by successive generations of the Harvey family from the 17th century through to the early 19th century, but not previously containing anything relating to the 3rd Earl of Bristol. It also further broadens the date range of pieces in the house by one of the 18th century's most important silver designers and retailers, Frederick Kandler, from his youth in 1745 to 6, and that's a triangular waiter for a tea kettle, to the very end of his long career in 1777 to 8, an assemblage of his work more comprehensive and extensive than can be found in any other publicly accessible collection. Furthermore, it stands as one of the late 18th century's greatest love tokens, so intimately related to 2 of the era's most colourful and charismatic characters. Thank you very much.
James, thank you very much indeed. I think now if people have got questions, if you could put them in the chat box, please. So I hope that we will have a few forthcoming. I don't think there's anything. Yes, there's a comment from Nigel Israel saying that divorce in the 18th century could only be obtained by private act of Parliament. It was extremely expensive and public, and they were very, very rare. And that there were only probably about 300 divorces from 1700 up until 1857. So presumably, James, there would have been a huge amount of, well, as you indicated, a lot of comment in the newspapers and broadsheets and things like that.
There would have been, but I don't think actually that money was a problem for Lord Bristol, nor indeed was he shy of it, because he had actually wanted to have a divorce earlier on. when he had his eye on Mary Moisey. So I think it was probably that it was just too complicated because of the circumstances of the Duchess of Kingston's, or I call her Duchess of Kingston, she was actually Countess of Bristol, of course, really, trial, and the fact that she fled to the continent, and also that he was within a year of his death. So I think he wasn't at all well, I suspect, anyway. So had he been fitter and lived longer, I suspect he probably would have pursued a divorce. And an example, I talked about the scandalous toilet services, and one of them was the Duke of Grafton. That was with his second marriage, because his first marriage had ended in divorce because both he and the Duchess were having affairs. She went on to marry the Earl of Upper Ossory, and he was expected to marry his mistress, but actually didn't, and then married respectably the second time around. So my suspicion is that, yes, it was incredibly difficult, and Mike's quite right to point that out, but I think actually he would have done under different circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Now, someone has said that they have sent you a couple of questions, James. I don't know if they're on your, you can find that on your chat. But in the meantime, Carissa says, are you aware of any British toilet service with the French item known as gantière avec gobelet couvert, which is a glove tray with covered beakers? Have you seen those in English toilet services?
Well, do you think those are the equivalent of the, and the name's completely out of my head now, which is stupid, but the covered bowls for some sort of sustenance that you get in English toilet services, and French, obviously, that usually rest on a stand. I don't know whether that is the same or not, but it could be.
Yes. Yes.
That's my only contribution. I'm not aware of anything else.
No, I can't.
Equell, thank you. Thank you. Teresa's just put it, Equell. Thank you. That's the word I was searching for. I'm not aware of anything, no.
Okay. Thank you. And comment, Tim saying, fascinating talk. I'm intrigued by its 17th century appearance, which you discussed, but its lower half is so like the services of about 1700 by Dighton, Nelm, etc. Even the cartouche at the bottom is late 17th century style. So I wonder if the mirror was made to go with an earlier set.
Ah, that is a very interesting idea. Oh gosh, what a fascinating thought. The first Earl of Bristol, well, married twice. His first wife died young. But his second marriage was in 1696, so I suppose it's perfectly possible there could have been a toilet service associated with it. And certainly, given the fact that the first Earl, as I made reference to, equipped his younger daughter with a toilet service, it seems almost incredible to think that his wife didn't have one. So that's a really, really interesting thought, and one that hadn't occurred to me before. And perfectly possible.
Then Glenn is asking whether Kandler would have supplied the glass as well, or would presumably he would have just sourced that from a specialist.
And we know that from the Wicks ledgers, that there are specialist suppliers who would have supplied that sort of thing. So yes, absolutely, that would have been provided by a specialist supplier. And bear in mind that not every, I suppose that brings the obvious point to the fore, that we talk about everything being by Kandler, but of course he's a retailer, and a major retailer as well. So an awful lot of what he's supplying is not by him. We certainly know that his salvers were made by John Carter. A lot of his salvers were made by John Carter. And in some cases, they definitely do have Carter's mark, including those that are related to the vine in Hampshire. But in others, he may well have stamped his own mark on as retailer.
And then there's a comment from Mia Jackson saying she thinks that there's the post-mortem inventory of Elizabeth Chudley in Paris, and she thinks a trip to Paris would be as and when such things are.
Well, I'm signed up. I'm signed up for as soon as we're possibly able to do so.
Anyway, James, I think probably if we wind it up now, but thank you very much for a really splendid start to the year. It's been a wonderful talk. Thank you. The next,
not at all.
next talk for the Society will be an open talk, so it will be open to non-members as well as members of the Society. So when it comes out, do please feel free to send the link on to friends who might be interested. It will take place on the 24th of February, and it's a double bill. Donna Stevens, who is a conservator at the V&A, but who now works freelance, will be talking about the care, but not the cleaning of silver, but how best to look after it and store it. And Stephen Goldsmith, an expert polisher who's worked for many of the leading goldsmiths, will be talking about his career in the industry. So I think we will now wind it up, but thanks very much indeed, James, for a great evening.